Hey guys, this is a short video where we talk about the brewlytics functional. So what is a functional? A functional is basically one step in the manual process that you used to perform. So it could be a query to a database, it could be leveraging a API or a service that you have set up to maybe do machine learning or um, to send out an email or something like that. It could be data manipulation. So, for example, if you have a table of data and you want to manipulate it, let's say remove a couple columns or filter the data down, it could be doing something like that. Another thing that it could be doing is a conversion. So if you have data in one data type within Brewlytics, for example, a string or a list, and you want to turn that into a table or maybe a GeoJSON file or maybe a Esri shape file. A functional could also be doing statistical or geospatial calculations. If you're just doing something like an aggregation, you want to figure out what a particular column has for the median value, especially if you were to group it with another value in a different column. That could be one thing that you're doing with a functional. You could be doing a more complex geospatial calculation. Let's say you want to do a geospatial join, or you want to take data from one table and then measure it against points or polygons in another table. It could be doing something like that. It could also be turning data into a different visualization output, a completely different file type. So let's talk first about the anatomy of a functional. And what we're going to do is quickly just go through some of these concepts and then jump into the tool and reinforce them on the actual tool. First, we'll talk about the inputs. So every functional has one or more inputs, and then every functional typically has one or more outputs. So the inputs are things like the parameters or the variables that you're setting up. In the case of a API, it might be where are you going to query this data for? What selectors are you going to put in here? What values are you going to query against this data set? And then the output could be something like a table. So you run the query and then you get a result table. Now that table can be hooked up to something else. And that's kind of the basic concept of how you string these functionals together. Another concept that we have is the notion of variables. So you can take one of these inputs and you can turn it into a variable, and then that would allow you to hook the same data object up to multiple functionals. So if you wanted to reuse something like an area of interest, a geographic constraint, you could hook that up to multiple functionals. We also have this notion of workflow outputs. So an output is something that kind of signifies within your workflow that this is an end result of your workflow. It has some special meaning when we talk about using the Brewlytics REST API, as well as using sub workflows within the Brewlytics environment. Last but not least, a little bit more of an advanced topic, which we'll cover in a different video at length. We have all of these different types of logic controls. So you have conditional hotspots, exception connectors, and complete connectors. Conditional hotspots allow you to hook up different types of conditions inside your workflow. So, for example, if you wanted to test whether a table had values in it or not, that conditional functional would either have a true or a false output. If you selected to hook up true to this conditional hotspot, this functional would only run if the upstream functional returned back true. And again, this is a little bit more on the advanced side, but we'll cover that in a separate video. Next, we have the exception and the complete connectors. The exception connector basically allows you to do error handling within your workflow. So, for example, if that functional or that database is unavailable, you can, within your functional, set what you want that workflow to do. Uh, One example of this would be, let's say you have two different databases and typically you want to query both of them, but you would much rather have some data than no data at all. You could set up a exception connector to allow you to at least get one of the results back. Complete connector is a little bit similar in that regard. However, the main difference is that whatever you connect to this complete connector, it will only run if that functional finishes. Okay, with that, let's jump into the tool and let's do a quick example of all those different concepts that we just learned about. So first, let's take a look at the inputs and outputs. I'm going to bring in a very simple functional defined string. And this functional just has one input, one output. It has an input string and it has an output string. If we read the description of this functional, it's very simple. It defines a string value. Let's just put in 1, 2, 3, and maybe test. Okay, so we put in those values, and when I hit complete, you can see this input light up with a green check mark. That means that input has been satisfied in some way. So I'm going to hit run, and now the output turns green. So this means that if I click on the functional, I'll see that I provided an input. And in this case, I got the same output because that's what defined string does. Now I can take this output and I can hook that string up to a myriad of different functionals that we have within the environment. We have hundreds of different functionals that you can go and search for and grab. I'm going to pull in the string to list functional. And what this does is it's a conversion. It converts this string into a list object. And so now if I hook up the output of this functional to the input of this functional, I've basically satisfied the input of the functional by using the output of that previous functional. And that's really the core concept of hooking these different functionals together to take data from one function and then connect it to the other, and then so on and so forth until you end up with the data that you want at the end of your workflow. Now, if I were to put this and hit play, I have a delimiter in here already as a comma. So if you remember, we defined these values with a comma in it. So what this is going to do is turn this string of text into a list object. And so now if I were to run this and then we pulled this list up, if I were to open this, you would see now it's kind of, they're all in the separate lines because they're different strings within that list. So it's no longer just a single string, it's now a list of strings. Now if we were to take this output list and hook that up to this functional, which is also a conversion functional, what we're doing is turning that list into a table of values. And so you can see there's some other inputs here. We have column name, we have table name, we've got the column type. In this case, I'm just going to we'll put test in here for the column name, and we'll run this. And now if I were to pull this up, we have an actual table of data. So if you wanted to do something like filter this data down or something like that, you'd be able to do that from here. Or maybe we want to convert this data. I can turn this into, well, in this case, we wouldn't turn it into GeoJSON. We would just turn it into JSON. I could say, I want this table to be a JSON file, or I want this table to maybe be an Excel file. So now let's run this whole thing. And so now we've kind of created those two files here, our Excel file and our JSON file. And we can open that up and see what it would look like, as well as we can download this Excel file and pull that up. Okay, so let's go back and talk about those variables now. If I were to take one of these inputs and right click it and hit create variable, that will pop up one of these objects here. And so now this variable would allow me to take that same string that we provided here and do something else with it within our workflow. One example might be if we wanted this column name for whatever reason to be that string value, I could hook that string value up there. And so now if I were to run this, it's actually going to give me an error because we can't have commas within a column name. So if I were to go back to this and say, I want this to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Notice that when I run this now, I'm actually not really going to be turning this into a list because we don't have the proper delimiter in here. If I go back into the string to list and now put my proper delimiter of a space and I run this, now we're going to have a proper list here. And then we defined it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're setting that up as our column name. So if I pop this up, I should see that as my column name now. So that's just kind of to show the flexibility and how you can hook these various data objects up within the workflow. We can also set up outputs, and an output is kind of a special object where if I were to now save this workflow, we'll just call it new workflow 39. I'm going to open up a new one. I can actually grab new workflow 39. I've got two of them here. This one here. And you can see that the only inputs and the only outputs of this sub workflow are the variables that we set up here and then the outputs that we set up here. But we're going to have a separate video explaining how all of that works and what the value of having something like that is. Next, let's talk about the conditional connectors. We have this whole set of conditional functionals. You can browse for them over here on the left side and pull up conditional. These would allow you to do things like check for conditions. For example, in this case, I just have is true, and that's what we're going to pull in right now. Is true allows me to set a Boolean value of true or false. And if I run this, if it's true, it's going to run this output. And if it's false, it's going to run this output. And so basically what I can do here is set up a Boolean to produce a JSON. And we'll actually call this produce JSON. And so if it's true, I'm going to produce the JSON. If it's false, I'm going to produce the Excel file. So now if I were to run this, you can see since I set it to true, this path down here is grayed out. This functional did not run, but this functional is green, so it did run. Now if I were to go in and change this value and run it, now the opposite happens. So that's what the conditional functionals allow you to do, as well as that conditional connector. Another thing that you have down here at the bottom are the complete connectors and the exception connectors. This allows you to handle an error. So for example, if I have a functional that would divide to integers, and maybe I want to try to divide by 0, this should actually throw an error. You can't divide by 0. So if I look at the error message, it says I can't divide by 0, so this functional errored out. And so what you can do now is say, hey, whenever this errors, I actually want you to run this functional. And whenever this completes, I instead want you to run this functional. Now, there could be different reasons why you might want to do this, but in an advanced workflow, this becomes extremely helpful. This was just a quick look at the functional, the anatomy of a functional, and all the different buttons and things like that that we have within the brewlytics environment. We're going to go more in detail on some of these concepts in further videos. Thanks.